Australia, the sixth largest country on Earth. An ancient, rugged, and unforgiving land with abundant animal life, both beautiful and deadly. Found within its awe-inspiring landscapes and natural beauty exists a deep history of unexplained mysteries for anyone with the courage to investigate them. Tonight, we join Ben on a journey across this vast island continent in search of answers to events that have reshaped the lives of so many that have been exposed to Unexplained Phenomena Australia. With your host, Ben Hurl.
G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. This week, I thought we would have a bit of a look at a potential list of what would be Australia's top 10 UFO cases. Now, that's a pretty hard thing to achieve because you've got to look at what sort of criteria are you going to assess them on. And that can range across many different aspects of the UFO phenomena. Now, the way that I look at it is I look at the cases in a way that I think this is what I want to see in what would rank into a top 10 case. I'd want to see that there was credible witnesses, potentially multiple witnesses. I'd want to see ground trace evidence, potentially. So marks on the ground, burnt trees, anything like that would be really good. I'd like to see animal effect. That's the type of thing that we're looking for. And also unusual objects. So when I say unusual objects, something that you would almost think that when someone's reporting it, that they couldn't possibly make it up. So that's another really good feature to have when you're looking at potential criteria for selection of cases. And the ones we're going to talk about tonight certainly do have all of those types of elements. And it's still a very difficult task because of the sheer number and volume of cases that have occurred here in Australia. But I'm going to have a crack at it anyway. And I'm going to talk about each case. And look, we may not even get to 10. It just depends how the time goes. But I'm going to try and stick to that as much as possible. So, and also with the top 10, I want to make it not necessarily a ranked top 10, because that really comes down to subjectivity. So my own personal opinion, which I have and hold on cases, but we'll do a top 10, but I'm not going to say that the first one I talk about is number 10 and the last one I talk about is number 1. These are all just cases that have occurred in Australia that are, I believe, significant. And I think that they rank well if you were to compare them to other places in the world. So that's the type of thing that I want to sort of qualify a top 10 with. And you can basically pick a state in Australia if you like. There's been so many good UFO cases around the country. Every state in Australia has had a fantastic array of UFO events, from Tasmania, Victoria, where I am, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, Northern Territory, and I have to say the ACT as well, not to leave them out. So every state has had a rich UFO history. Now, I'm not going to try and challenge myself to select one from each state, which would make up, the top 6. I think I'll just go for what I think are the cases that stand out to me. And then you can make of it what you will. Now, the 10 cases that I'm going to talk about, there is a lot of other cases out there too that could quite easily make it onto the list. So it's really just a bit of a fun exercise for this week's show to have a look at some of these cases that are great. Some of them I've spoken about in other episodes, Now, this show has been running for a while now, and I don't keep track of what episode is which. Um, so that's just the way I am. I just present the episodes each week, and I could have done 50. I could have done 5 shows. It doesn't matter to me. I just do the shows each week. But across the journey of what unexplained phenomena has been, I have covered a lot of really interesting cases. And if you've sort of followed Unexplained Phenomena Australia from the beginning, you'll see that yes, there really was a lot of highly interesting UFO events that occurred in Australia over a very long period of time. From the let's just pick a point in time from the 1800s, from white settlement through to now, and the Aborigines had all sorts of experiences with UFOs and entities and that type of thing. So, and of course, if you're choosing a criteria, you should obviously have entities on that as well. So, are there entities? Did entities appear? That's almost the holy grail, really, in terms of a UFO case. So, things like physical trace cases, effects on witnesses, close encounters, up close, and animal effects if that's appropriate to it, and good detailed description of presumably an unusual craft, and ideally there might be some occupants on the ground too. So they're the factors that I regard as being what you'd want in a top 10 of UFO cases from anywhere around the world. And so the one I'm going to start with tonight is it was a very famous case at the time. It made headlines around the country in a negative way. So that's the first thing that we have to talk about with this particular UFO encounter. It was received in a very, or it was portrayed in a very negative light, which was terribly unfair to the people involved that they got that experience from the media. Now, the media usually will do one of two things. They will either ridicule on one hand and put some poor group of people or witness to the sword and say, they'll just make light of it, depending on who's in charge of making the production. Or they'll say, okay, we'll approach it with an open mind, which happens less frequently, or historically has happened less frequently. Although in recent times we've seen, that they're taking UFO sightings and accounts perhaps a little bit more seriously than they have in the past. And here in Australia, we've just had Close Encounters Down Under air on 7 Mate here, and it's also going to be seen in Europe and America as well. And I made it onto episode 4 with a personal encounter, and they talk about different events around Australia, some new, some historical. And that's been the first Australian televised production in decades, since the 1990s. Can you believe that? There hasn't been an Australian TV show or series that has focused on UFOs since the mid 1990s when Oz Encounters came out. If you want to YouTube that one, it's actually quite a good documentary and worth watching. That's Oz Encounters. Covers a lot of really good cases, and it was done in a really good way. And I still think that sets a higher benchmark than the one that's just been made recently. So it's been pretty light on the ground for that type of thing. Now, this particular case, it just really suffered a lot. And it was probably also the witnesses that contributed to it in an unwitting kind of a way. They were just an ordinary working class family from Perth. They'd never had any media experience or anything like that. And they were just going about their business, and they reported what happened to them, their terrifying encounter, in a straightforward way. And the interview is on YouTube as well. And the encounter is the Knowles family case, which really is a very extraordinary event. And if you're doing a top 10, they all have to be extraordinary events. So if you've never heard of that case, and some of you will and some of you won't, I'll do a bit of a recap on it. So the Knowles family, on the 20th of January 1988, was the night that them and their 2 dogs had an unexplainable experience while traveling across the Nullarbor Plain. Now, the Nullarbor Plain is that big open desert area that is in South Australia and Western Australia. It's just a long straight road that drives right across the centre of both of those states. And it was about 4 a.m. So late night, really late into the night and sort of early morning. I regard 3 a.m. as being the witching hour or the golden hour for seeing things, but 4 a.m. is still pretty good too. And out on the Nullarbor Plain, well, there is literally nothing around, so it's not a populated area. So Faye Knowles, who was the mother, and her sons, Patrick, who was 24, Sean, 21, and Wayne, 18, were between Madura and Mundrabilla, two little specks on maps, with Sean was driving and Patrick was next to him in the front seat when a bright light was seen ahead of them. Now, Sean thought the light was strange and asked his brother if he thought it was a spaceship. And that idea was rejected by his brother. So that was skeptics to begin with, I suppose. And Sean's interest was piqued, and he sped the car up in order to catch up with the object and get a closer look. And at about 20 metres from the object, so he actually got pretty close to it, about 20 metres from the object, the family say that they were then confronted with a white blinding light that moved along in front of their moving vehicle. A white blinding light. And it was about 1 metre wide and described as a slightly angular egg in an egg cup shape with a yellow centre. Now, the object, which at first appeared to be either on the ground or above it, then began to move back and forth. And Sean swerved the car to the opposite side of the road to avoid a collision with the object, but then nearly collided with a station wagon towing a caravan coming the other direction. Now, those people never came forward. They were never spoken to. Whoever was driving the caravan coming the opposite way, they were never found by investigators back in January and the months thereafter in 1988. So the object then circled around to the right side of their car and appeared to give chase to the second vehicle towing the caravan. Now, the Knowles made two U-turns at this point, and the first to give chase to the object and the second to abandon this idea as they had grown frightened, as you probably would. So they had at this point gained the idea that the object was actually chasing after them. So this is an interesting aspect of it too. Like, if you're saying that they were having some sort of mass hallucination or, something like that they'd spooked themselves unbelievably, but the case gets a lot more intense, as it goes along. So at some point, the family felt the UFO had returned and had landed on their vehicle. They heard a clunking sound and felt that the car was being pushed down by a weight that rested on top of it. And by now, the family was understandably absolutely frightened. And what happened after that made it hard to unravel what had actually occurred. But the family believed that the car was lifted off the road. It was actually lifted up, and they couldn't estimate how high or for how long. And the mother, Mrs. Knowles, she wound down a rear window and reached for the roof. And she felt something soft and rubbery that was hot but did not burn her hand. When she brought her hand back into the car, she found it was covered in a blackish dust. And this event caused a panic in the rest of the family. Patrick wound down his window only to be covered in the fine dust, and it was also accompanied by what they described as a foul smell, likening to that of dead bodies or rotting corpses. And a high-pitched sound was then heard, which sent the dogs into a frenzy. The family became disorientated and felt that their voices had become slower and lower in pitch. They believed at this point that they were going to die. So pretty serious consequences in their beliefs. Patrick said that he felt that his brain was being sucked out, and his mother likened it to having something going into our heads. And that's an interesting aspect of this particular encounter as well, that they felt like their heads were being sucked out. I wonder what effect was causing that. And then a while later, the family felt the car forced back onto the road, bursting the rear right tyre. Sean brought the car to a sudden stop and then blacked out. And the family left the car hurriedly and hid in some bushes by the side of the road. And they remained there for about 15 minutes before changing the tyre and continuing on to the nearest town. Now, unknown to the family, a truck driver, Mr. Graham Henley, he also saw at the same time in the same area a strange light in the rearview mirror. And he described it as being like a strong spotlight and a big fried egg hung upside down. He kept the object in view for 5 minutes and did not see any car headlights beneath it. And shortly after that, the truck driver pulled into Mudrobilla. He saw the Knowles car arrive, and he was confronted by the frightened family, all trying to describe their experience. And he looked over their car and confirmed the presence of a black ash in various areas, both inside and on the exterior of the vehicle. And he likened it to a fine silicon, sort of a sand, and it had a burnt odor to it. And he also noticed 4 indents on the roof of the car and the damaged tyre. And Henley and 2 of his friends also surveyed the scene of the incident, finding skid marks, footprints, and tread tracks that they felt confirmed the Knowles account of their incident. So that's the basics of that particular report. And wow, what a case. That really is incredible. And when you look at it, the way that the media leaped on it, and it was practically in every newspaper in the country, and they did a famous interview on TV with it wasn't Mike Willis, it was his brother, and he just basically tore them to pieces. And it was a really sad day for what you'd call UFO witnesses at that particular time, because they were just put to the sword with their whole experience. And as a result of that experience, like, they didn't make any money out of it. Nothing like that happened. They all just faded back into obscurity. And have tried to track various members of the family down, but it's been hard to track them. And I haven't tried too hard either. I've just, had random looks at different times trying to find them when I've thought of the case. But it is a really good case. And it does deserve to be, I regard, a top 10 case in Australia, because it's got multiple witnesses. It's got animal effect. It's got physical effect on the witnesses, and it's also got physical effect on the car. And the whole thing really ended up being, the way it was treated by the media almost made the whole thing seem dubious to a point. The way that they spoke about it was very, just they didn't talk about it in a way that was open-minded and credible. So, I just think that, I'd like to say to the Knowles family that I feel really sorry for them on the way that they were handled at that time. Would it be any different now? Interesting question. Going from 1988 through to 2023, would they have been treated any differently? They may have been able to capture vision of it if it had happened later in time, in 2023, for example. They probably would still have go under the microscope of the media, but they may have come out perhaps a little bit better in light of recent years and the way that the UFO field has just really moved forward since that time. So another really incredible case that I want to talk about too, and I love police cases because I think police really do make great witnesses. Now, this case was in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. No maps tonight. I'm not bringing out the Google Maps for this one. Just gonna talk about these cases. And Melton at that time, this is actually called the Melton incident. And Melton was a little town that was west of Melbourne. Now it's practically incorporated into Melbourne, and it's a huge growth expansion area out in the western corridor of Melbourne's development. But back in 1983, it was just a country town. And there was wide open spaces around it, lots of flat land in that area. It's not a forested area. It's just an open plain area. The Western Highway runs through it to Ballarat, which is in central Victoria, another great UFO hotspot in the Goldfield area of central Victoria. So this case occurred on the 22nd of July, 1983, so in the dead heart of winter. So we've gone from the Knowles family in summertime to this police case in July. July is cold in Australia. That's the middle month of our winter. And what happened was there was two police constables in their little what they call a divisional van in Australia. So basically a patrol car, if you like, and they were out doing their rounds, driving out around a couple of other smaller towns out in that area, and they noticed a light hovering over the downtown Melton shopping centre. And I've been to Melton, I've been to the shopping centre. We did a whole tour out there on this particular case. And we went to the shopping centre's three times the size as it was in 1983. But they drove their patrol car back to the shopping centre, and they saw this object hovering above it. And they sat there looking at it, and it sort of appeared to have this sort of a gantry coming off it, almost looked like what they described as a gyrocopter, but it wasn't anything like that. They contemplated taking their guns and I spoke to one of the constables, and he said we contemplated putting a couple of zingers into it, but they thought the better of that, and then in the end didn't actually shoot at it, but they just watched it, and then it took off. And as they were driving around, they noticed another object hovering around, and this one was also a big sort of a rectangular shaped object with a bright light on the front and red lights around it, and it was also out there drifting around. Now, these policemen plus other patrol cars from even from other districts, they chased those UFOs around the outer western area of Melbourne all night, practically. So they would come and go, and at one point, one of the objects actually at that stage there was an array of military defence array of antennas at a place which was called the Rock Bank Listening Station. So it used to be an array of antennas, and one of them nearly ran into the whole antennas that are there. They're all gone now; they don't exist anymore. And I tried to find where they were, and roughly did find where they were, but there's no remains of them there now. Maybe some cement blocks or something like that, but there's nothing to really look at. And the objects floated towards these antennas, these defense antennas, and then it made a turn and drifted off. So, and even the senior police who were on duty at the Melton police station, they walked outside and they saw this thing come floating right over the top of the police station. And they chased that around for hours. And it was really only until the pre-dawn light when it actually disappeared and everything was quiet again. Now, they didn't pick anything up on radar, or they said they didn't pick anything up on radar. They said that the altitude wasn't high enough for the radars to pick it up from Tullamarine, Melbourne's international airport. And back in the day, we sought out and got to speak to one of the constables, one of the two constables, and he's now a very senior ranking inspector in Victoria Police. And he agreed to talk to us, which was really amazing that he did in the first instance. And we met him in a hotel somewhere out in Doncaster, I think it was, in just north of the Melbourne there. And we met him there, and he recounted this whole experience to us and said that it was absolutely incredible, and they didn't know what they were looking at. And he wanted it to be a logical explanation. He wanted to say that yes, it was aircraft, yes, it was someone mucking around up in the air playing practical jokes. But he can't arrive at that conclusion. And he says, even to this day, and this is all these decades later, 40 odd years later, that he still couldn't process what they had seen on that particular night. And he was very, very matter of fact and a lot of good candor in how he described what they experienced. We had a map; he drew it all out, and it was really an incredible experience. So I put that in the top 10 because it has got police officers probably nearly up to 8 or 10 police officers across the ones at the station and the ones that were out in divisional vans driving around, or patrol cars driving around. They had really seen something for an extended period of time. So I ranked that as a high case, and it did make it into the media. It was reported on. Channel 7 in Melbourne at the time took their helicopter out there, and there's a couple of old clips online of that report where they flew in the same area at the same altitude, all around that area out there where this object had been. And they interviewed the policeman involved, and they just matter of factly spoke about it. And it was treated relatively not light-hearted, but not skeptical. So they just said, yeah, we didn't know what it was, and something was flying around it here. And the police probably kind of undersold it in some ways. It was probably and according to the police inspector that we spoke to, that it had a much higher effect on them than the way it was presented in the media. So that was a very incredible encounter, which is amazing. That makes it into my top 10 tonight. Now, the other one that I think is really, really good is the Jolly Farm encounter. So that was up in northern Victoria, and I have spoken about this on a previous episode, but that definitely makes it into the top 10 for me. And why? Because I almost sort of wanted to describe this farm as being our Skinwalker Ranch in some ways, because they'd had multiple encounters out there over a period of time in the late 80s. Now, it's right up in the very north of Victoria, and it's just in wheat country where they have big wheat farms with big combine harvesters. And what happened, what triggered the whole thing was that the contractors were coming through on the particular farm. I found the farm. I know where the farm is. It's about 8 hours for me to drive there, so that's not going to happen anytime soon. The original family, the father and the mother have both passed away, and the other principal witness, their son, he's in the Northern Territory somewhere, and he's almost virtually untraceable, because I at one stage I got onto a local group there, asked if anyone knew about it, and someone knew about it or remembered it, and then said, yeah, no, he moved away. We haven't heard from him in a long time. We only know he went up to the Northern Territory. We don't know where he is. And I had since found out that the two parents, who were well and truly in their 60s back in the 80s, so they're gone at that time. So the whole case started off with the contract combine harvesters coming in, and they were going to harvest the wheat. And up in the combine harvesters, which are quite high, they could see these rings on the ground, and they didn't go over the rings. They just went around it, and they told the farm owners. Now the rings were the flattened wheat, as you'd say completely. The ground was like it was baked, so you had soft soil around the plants, but when you came to the rings, it was like a hard baked center there. So whatever it had been there had experienced presumably heat or moisture sucking or whatever it was, however you want to describe it. And then when it was investigated later on by John Orquettel, who went up there with his wife one day, spent the whole day out there and they found so many circles out there that he got sick that day and had sort of like feverish type responses on the way home. And they also found that there was some type of a sound out there, an audible sound when you're in the circles, which was recorded. And there was seen to be this sort of like a vortex of energy that was above each of these circles in the wheat paddocks. So there are other episodes I've done that explain these cases in greater detail, but this is really pretty much just a recap, put them in the top 10. And one night the son woke up in the house. He was there by himself, and he heard this almighty sound that was described it like a jet screaming, and it was outside the house. He didn't know what it was. There was no sign of anything out there, but he could hear this jet screaming, nothing visible. Then on another night, the family came home and they found that they could see that all their sheep were pushed up into one corner of the paddock, and on the other side was this big bright ball of energy or light was hovering over the paddock, looking at the sheep. Now, as the family appeared, the object then disappeared, and they went out there. They found that the sheep were all disorientated out there, and they found an eagle on the ground, a big Australian wedge-tail eagle, and he was disorientated and just walking around and had no sense of up or down or anything like that. And the next day, the sheep were normal, and the eagle had obviously flown off. He'd recovered. So that's a top 10 case for me as well. That's a really, really good case. The other one that makes it into the top 10, you would have to say the Rosedale water tank one, which I spoke about in recent weeks as well, when farmer George Blackwell in September 1980 was awoken by all his stock, And he went out at 1 o'clock in the morning. All the cows were running around and his horse as well. And he saw this thing come up the paddock, low, really low, and crossed the building and went down a little laneway, hovered over a water tank, drained the water, and landed on the ground next to the tank. And it did that within 2 minutes. The 10,000 gallon tank was drained. It hovered over the tank for a minute, and then it sat on the ground. Got on his bike. He rode out there, and it made a big screeching sound. It was making a sound the whole time he saw it, and a big black, sort of inflated, like you'd call like an inner tube, appeared underneath it. And then when it took off, it dropped all the cow patties and rocks, and the tank had been drained of all its water. And he had physical effect on him as well. So he was sick for 5 days afterwards, had headaches from 11 o'clock till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. His watch stopped on his wrist at 10 past 1 when it happened. He'd take it off, put it on the bench, it would start again, put it on his wrist again, it would stop. That continued for 3 days. So that was a highly, highly credible case that also makes it into the top 10 as well. Very good case. Made a video on it. That's on my channel, Ben Hurl. If you look that up on YouTube, you can watch that. It's there. So that's a top 10 case. I also think that, for the obvious reasons, that there was physical trace evidence, there was animal effect, there was effect on humans as well, and that did get media attention also back in the day. That did receive quite a bit of attention. It made it into the papers, made it into the Melbourne Truth, which was a bit of one of those sort of what do you call them, tabloid type of newspapers that ran in Melbourne for quite a long time. And it made it onto The Extraordinary, which was a series that was made during the 1980s in Australia that looked at mysterious events. They did an episode on the Jolly Farm incident as well. So that's definitely a top 10 case in Australia. Now, I think we would be not doing the right thing unless we went to 1966 and we spoke about the Westall case, which has had a lot more attention over the last, let's say, the last 10 years. Prior to 10 years ago, it was pretty much an unknown, unheard of event. I'd read about it in UFO books probably years ago, so I was aware of it. I was aware of a school in Melbourne that had a mass witness sighting of UFOs by the student body, or 150, 200 students, somewhere in that vicinity. Now, it was the 6th of April 1966, and that was 2 days after the bending headlights case at Burke's Flat, where Ron Sullivan had been driving along at night, and he saw this object that divided into two with all these lights flowing between the two halves, and his headlights were bent off the side of the road, and he nearly crashed into a tree. And then 2 days later, a young man was killed at the exact same spot. So the Westall case occurred 2 days after the Ron Sullivan encounter in the same year, 1966. So I actually haven't done an episode on Westall yet because it's such a big case, and you could probably do 3 episodes just on Westall alone, like I did the Kempsey encounters for 3 episodes. So the Westall encounter was on the 6th of April, mid-morning, 10:30, 11 o'clock, around that sort of time. Students were out playing cricket on the oval, and they were in the classes, and one of the girls comes running inside to the science teacher, and she says, Mr. Greenwood, there's flying saucers outside. And everybody went outside and they had a look, and sure enough, there's these objects coming out of the northwest in the sky, traveling along, and they go over the school, and the student body, word got around pretty quick, and they're all standing out in the oval, and they saw these objects fly over. And then they disappeared down into the Grange, the Grange is a weird little park that's not far from the Westall school. It's only probably a few hundred meters south of the school. Been there many times. And some of the objects came and drifted through the trees, as in, like, they didn't just weave through the trees, they sort of dissolved through the trees, landed on the ground. Students ran over, and a couple of the students got really close to the landed saucer, and it eventually lifted off into the sky. And by this stage, there was about 5 Cessnas in the air trying to chase these objects around. Imagine trying to chase them in Cessnas. I mean, it's a bit Stone Age, isn't it? So, and then the students were they got into trouble for leaving the school grounds in 1966. If you left the school grounds, that's serious. You know, a bit different in 2023. The world's changed a lot, but back then, the students were fearful of teachers to a certain extent back in that time, and discipline was certainly a lot stronger than it is now. And the student body were all brought back in, and they were all told you saw nothing. And men with uniforms came and they went out to where the circles were in the ground. And they destroyed the circles, and the media did one report on it, which has disappeared and hard to find. The Channel 9 came out and did a couple of interviews. No one's found that footage since. It made it into the nearby Dandenong Journal, the newspaper. And then the science teacher was threatened that if he spoke about it, he'd be discredited and his teaching career would be over. So it became this massive event seen by lots of people in suburban Melbourne, 1966. 150 witnesses, including the primary school nearby too. Some of the small kids at that time had also witnessed this event. But the whole thing was shut down. The whole thing was hushed up. And for decades, it was an unheard of event. 70s, 80s, 90s, not until you get into the 2000s did the case start to come back out again, start to breathe a life of its own. So it was an incredible encounter. And now it's been covered in a great documentary called Westall 66, made by lead researcher Shane Ryan and Rosie Jones, Melbourne-based filmmaker. And it's probably one of the best UFO documentaries that I've ever seen. And you can definitely Google that on YouTube, Westall 66. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's great. So that is a top 10 case as well. Now, another one I want to put in the top 10 is, you'd have to say the Fred Valentich encounter is a top 10 case in Australia, where Fred took off from Moorabbin Airport on the 21st of October 1978, bound for King Island. But King Island is a little island between mainland Australia and Tasmania. And when he just got off Cape Otway at the bottom there, where he was turning to make the final part of the trip down to King Island, which you could virtually see from the air anyway, he encountered this object, and he had this incredible conversation with Steve Roby, who was in flight services at Tullamarine, and both pilot and plane disappeared. Well, that made international news at the time, and Fred was never found. The plane was never located despite 2-week search. They didn't find a single trace of wreckage with the plane. Now, there's been a lot of coverage on that particular case. I've had George Simpson on the show with me on previous episodes. We spoke about George's book, Under the Radar, or Nothing on Radar, I think it's called. Might have got that wrong. So Nothing on Radar, that's what it's called. And that received a huge amount of publicity. So you got a missing plane, missing pilot, UFO, very credible, and Australia's biggest transport mystery. What happened to Fred? What happened to the plane? That's got to be in a top 10 as well. And I'm not going to go into that too much more than that to say that most of you probably would have heard of that particular incident, but it rates right up there in a top 10 scenario. So now there's other cases that have occurred around Australia and then you'd also probably have to put the Kelly Cahill case into the top 10 as well. Done a previous episode on that. That was in winter 1993, and she was traveling had just left a friend's place with her husband. They were traveling home, and they saw this football field size object off in a paddock. And now the amazing thing about this case was there was multiple witnesses at that time. There were 3 other cars, multiple people, all got out of their cars, walked over and watched this football field sized UFO hovering over a field, which I've been to again lots of times as well, and hovering out there. And then these beings appeared out of a blue light at the bottom of the craft. It had big amber windows on it. And the beings came across, they all got knocked out. And then over a series of weeks and months after that, the whole thing came back to them. There's a big investigation to find the witnesses, of which they were found. And they were interviewed. Then there became this the case sort of deteriorated from there. There was reasons for why Kelly withdrew from it and lost interest in being involved in it. And the people from the other cars had got involvement with other people who were pulling them in different directions. So the whole case fell over. So that had the potential to be a world-beating case, that one. but ultimately, disappointingly, it ended up going nowhere. So that's another case that I would rate rather highly in Australia's potential list of great UFO encounters. So you have to talk about Kelly Cahill. So we've talked about Westall, we've talked about Mundrabilla, we've talked about the Jolly Farm, we've talked about Kelly Cahill, and the Melton case. So we're about halfway through on the top 10. So some of these cases you're probably aware of, others you might not have heard of, and you can check out the previous episodes or Google any of those names that I've spoken about, and information will come up on them. So it's very hard to, and there's a lot of other cases I could just go, oh, this one, that one, that one, that one, that one, but we're trying to keep it onto an even sort of a keel as to how to assess this. Now, I also probably do regard the Kempsey flap as being an incredible, probably in the sixth case that we're going to talk about tonight, which I did 3 episodes on. That was with a whole series of UFO encounters around the town of Kempsey during the 70s. And if you haven't seen those episodes, go back and check them out. Kempsey 1, part 1, part 2, and even part 3. The whole thing famously started off with a man being sucked out, seeing a little face in his kitchen window, and then being sucked out through the window himself in a horizontal position. Work out which way this screen works, like that, and he got pulled out and he fell on the ground, and that made it into the papers. And the whole Kempsey saga is really very interesting. So that was a long and extended flap too. In Kempsey's in New South Wales. It's sort of north of Sydney, and that was a particularly great series of events at that time. So, and I rate it for the fact that there was so many witnesses, there was so many close encounters with craft, either on the ground or at close proximity to witnesses. The man who got sucked through the window, that seemed to me to be a most extraordinary aspect to the case. And a lot of people would say, well, did it really happen? Didn't it happen? But he never wanted to live in the house again, so he just moved on and moved away. So that's a very interesting flap, and I think that rates very highly. Now, there's been other flaps around Australia as well, and they're also quite good additionally. And there's also been flap years in Australia. So there was in the early 50s, there was a flap year. 1966 was a flap year. Early 70s was just amazing in Australia. 71, 72, 73. They were just, I wish I hadn't have been just a small child at that particular point in time. Wish I had been a fully grown functional UFO researcher in the 1970s in Australia, because I reckon that's almost the golden era of so many interesting things going on in across the whole country. So we've spoken about great cases in South Australia as well that have occurred. Been plenty over there. There's just been this whole plethora of cases that have just blown people away. And the other one that I think was really a very interesting case that would probably come into the top 10, coming in not at number 7, but it's about number 7 where we're up to. That was the case of Bronte Lloyd. So he was the farmer in South Australia who had a really strange experience at his farm. Now, that also had animal effect. It had physical effect on the ground, and it had physical effect on the witness. So that was a very strange and unusual incident. Now, I did a episode on the Bronte Lloyd situation, and he ended up having these marks on his cheeks where he had been either abducted or whatever, but he had these permanent marks on his cheeks that looked like big rosy circles around here, and he lived with them for the rest of his life. He had an entity in his house. a object outside on the ground. The dogs came running and were barking and were terrified. That was another really highly credible case that should definitely represent in a top 10 case. All these ones I've spoken about so far have ticked off those criterias of entities and animal effect, physical effect on witnesses. That's all been, first class stuff. Now, another case that was really very interesting, perhaps makes it into the top 10, was also in 1966, was the Tully encounter, where two farmers had found this, what was almost the first crop circle in Australia, where in a lagoon, one of the farmers had seen this object rise out of the lagoon, this UFO rise out, and then underneath it, there was all this flattened reed area that had been put down in a circular pattern. All the reeds had been flattened. There was a large circle in this lagoon, basically what was called a UFO nest. And it couldn't be explained by the Royal Australian Air Force came out and investigated it. The area was said to have had a history of these rings over time. And it was just one of those cases that it made a big impression at the time. And in Australia, it really started the crop circle type of a phenomena here. It was the one that really sort of brought that off. Even though there'd been plenty of crop circles around the place, the Tully Lagoon really did make it take it to another level. And so after that, you definitely had this situation where people, it was just became, people knew what a crop circle was. So that was really, really good. And I think we're getting up to about number 8. The weird encounter out at Kimber in South Australia, out in the middle of nowhere. That's a highly rating case too. When it was in 1973, in the golden years, when I was so happy with UFO encounters being a really good time. That was when people were driving along on the highway and they saw this object on the side of the road, this rectangular orange light, and this big white being sort of in and around that area. And I did do an episode on the Kimber encounter as well. And it had basically multiple witnesses at the time. Very strange case, extremely strange case and I even got on Google Maps and walked out there on Google Maps trying to find the exact area where it was. Definitely in the right area, like no question I was in the right area, but after 1972, very hard to try and track down where these travelers had come down the highway and they'd seen this rectangular light and this tall white creature or being in the light standing there at the same time. It was a very, very extremely unusual incident. Rates very highly, in my opinion, for being up there as well. And there's been so many other great cases as well. So we're up to about, we've just done number 8 or so. We're around there in the top 10. And you just sort of go, wow, it's just an amazing number of cases that are out there that really just blow your mind. Now, the desert country has seen a lot of UFO cases as well. Lots of stuff out in the deserts. And you would really say that the Knowles case was not solitarily on its own. There were other cases that were just amazing around that as well. People being chased by lights out on the Nullarbor Highway, or even chased for hours along desert roads out there with UFOs playing games and having all sorts of effects out there. So that really did make a big impact. Now, the other case that makes it into the top 10 in Australia is the Fernvale case, which was in the 1920s. And that to me was one of the most incredible cases that I think ever occurred in Australia. Had a lot of sinister things going on in it. And I did an episode on that. And it was about, it was on a farm, kind of similar to the Jolly Farm, in that this farm area was attracting this paranormal activity back in the 1920s. and it was lights in the sky flying around a family's home. There were these giant birds that were associated with it as well. Like sometimes there's this cryptid type of experience where giant birds of an unknown species, not seen before by anyone in the local area, not native to the area. The birds were these were giant birds. They were, like they were I think up to like 2 meters tall, big birds. And there was a strange situation where the cows had been herded all around the paddock, and a they'd found a pig that had been in a sty, and this pig had been completely destroyed. It had had escaped from the sty, and they found up on the hill, all the cows were all standing around, and there was this big blood patch where they found pig hair in it. So, and it even had strange people appearing as well, which was another weird aspect to the case. And it was described that the neighbours had a night out, and this man dressed in white had appeared at this community gathering, and nobody knew specifically who he was. And they all thought he belonged to someone else at the party. He must have been someone else's friend, and he didn't talk to anybody. He just appeared 1927, and and one of the brothers hadn't gone. He stayed at the home, and after this individual had left the party, the other brother had heard a noise outside, and he went out and he saw this white figure running away from the house. Very creepy, very strange. A car turned up at the house, opened up a gate, and drove into the paddock right out to where, where their incidents had been, where the pig was. This strange car drove out there. So that 1927 case, which was brought to light by Bill Chalker, that would definitely be in a top 10 case for me as well. And that was over a series of days, a series of weeks, that and different to Kempsey, different to flaps of this 1970s and the 1960s. This whole Fernvale case had a real kind of a sinister edge to it in many ways, and that's what really sort of drew me to it as being, we'd love it to occur today, like to have that sort of experience, but it doesn't happen now. So that's the unfortunate part about it. So you'd have to rate Fernvale as being right up there. Now, another case that I really, really sort of fell in love with, and I thought it was a great case that rates highly in Australia, another fairly unknown case, was the Dargo one, which was in 1976, which is two farmers going to turn off a water pump, and they had a crop of what you'd call pickles or gherkins, and they were going out there at night to turn it off. And as they drove out there, this little light just started pacing the car, and the light was following the car and next to the car, and they went down through this wooded area and they lost sight of it. And then they came up a long hill, and they saw this object go racing up the hill ahead of them, and it sat at the top of the hill waiting for the car to appear. When the car appeared, it shone this brilliant bright light right down over the whole area, and the witness described it to me as being almost like a searing heat, a bright daylight searing heat. And they went down to the pump, and it followed them all the way down. It hovered above the pumping station while they turned the pump off, and they were frightened by this stage and hopped in the car and raced back out, and it followed them all the way back. Really credible case. People not looking for any type of publicity at all. And I also found that when I was out there, this is what happens when you investigate. This is some of my own personal encounters, that you find other things come out of it. Other people will tell you that, yes, we saw something, and this happened to my husband, and that type of thing. I spoke about that Yowie encounter in last week's episode. That was in that same area, and that came from that same case when I was investigating it. And when I spoke to the witness, she was she was still frightened about it. And she was well in her 80s by this stage, and she was in her 40s when she had the encounter, and was pretty reluctant to talk about it. And we were lucky to even get anything out of her. So I hope you've enjoyed that little wander through today of looking at say 10 cases. Now, those 10 cases are all highly highly credible cases. Every one of them. Some of them I've had personal investigation with, others I haven't had investigation with. Now I could go out there again and I could find another 10 cases that you could say deserve to be in the top 10. But that's just some of the ones that I've looked at over the journey so far that I've found interesting. They have captivated me from the minute I heard about them for all the reasons that we've discussed in this week's episode. So, very puzzling. So, if you want to check out some of those ones I've talked about in previous episodes, by all means, go back and look through them, revisit them if you have heard them again. It's always nice to listen to them, perhaps revisit them again, some of these cases. And being a real maps person, I love getting out there and seeing where these cases occurred and going there. Walking the history of UFO encounters to me is a really satisfying thing to do. Love the cold cases. Love to go to where these things have occurred. I haven't been to Mundrabilla over on the Nullarbor Plain where the Knowles family case occurred. I haven't been there. I haven't been to Fernvale. I haven't been up there. I haven't been to Kempsey. So there's so many places out there, but I have been to Melton and I have been to Westall and I have been to some of these other places that I've been to Burke's Flat. So I have been to some of these places, haven't been to others. So as I journey around doing all my investigations, I like to try and tick some of these off the UFO bucket list as I get to travel around Australia, hopefully at some point in the future. So thanks for joining me on this episode. I hope you found it interesting. A bit of a recap. Look at some of these cases from a perspective that they do rate very highly. They would rate very highly in any environment around the world. They're all Australia's high quality UFO events. So thanks for joining me. Can't wait to see you again next week, and we'll delve into something interesting again, I'm sure. So enjoy your night, and I'll see you then.